York, this is Democracy Now!
With
the courage that I had in me, I went to the office to start my work, but the current system's soldiers didn't give me permission to start my work. They told me that the regime has changed. You are not allowed. Go home.
Since the Taliban seized control of Afghanistan, many women say they're afraid to go out. An Afghan news anchor says the Taliban prohibited her from returning to work. We'll speak with 3 Afghan women, 2 former journalists, who have fled their country, one in 2017, one last month, and one who left Friday. She says, "My Taliban nightmare came true. I left, but my sister couldn't." Then we'll look at President Biden's defense of the U.S. withdrawal of Afghanistan.
No mistakes?
No, I don't think it could have been handled in a way that we're going to go back in hindsight and look, but the idea that somehow there's a way to have gotten out without chaos ensuing, I don't know how that happens.
We'll speak with Craig Whitlock, investigative reporter for The Washington Post. He's covered the longest war in U.S. history and is author of the new book, The Afghanistan Papers, A Secret History of the War. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Afghan protesters have taken to the streets for a second day in a row in defiance of the Taliban, which seized control of the country Sunday. Protests have been held in Kabul and other cities today to mark Afghan Independence Day. Al Jazeera reports 2 people died in the city of Asadabad after the Taliban opened fire on protesters waving the Afghan national flag during an Independence Day celebration. There were reports the firing began after someone stabbed a member of the Taliban. This comes a day after the Taliban killed 3 protesters in Jalalabad. On Wednesday, ousted Afghan President Ashraf Ghani spoke publicly for the first time since fleeing Kabul. Speaking from the United Arab Emirates, Ghani said he left Afghanistan to prevent more bloodshed.
All my colleagues in the West told me that if I don't leave, things would be worse. I could have stayed and started a war, but I had a responsibility to my people, and I didn't want to start a bloodbath like in Syria and Yemen.
President Biden says U.S. troops will stay in Afghanistan until every American is evacuated, even if that means staying beyond his August 31st deadline. This comes as evacuation flights continue from the airport in Kabul, but many Afghans can't make it safely to the airport. Taliban fighters have shot at and whipped some of the people trying to flee. Meanwhile, Wednesday night, U.S. forces fired tear gas at Afghans trying to reach the airport, which is controlled by the U.S. military. Al Jazeera reports at least 12 people have been killed in or around the airport this week. Meanwhile, President Biden's defending his handling of the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. He was interviewed by George Stephanopoulos on ABC.
So you don't think this could have been handled, this actually could have been handled better in any way? No mistakes?
No, I don't think it could have been handled in a way that we're going to go back in hindsight and look, but the idea that somehow there's a way to have gotten out without chaos ensuing, I don't know how that happens.
The Biden administration's announced plans to begin offering vaccine booster shots starting September 20th, citing new CDC studies showing the declining effectiveness of COVID vaccines over time. The U.S. decision has been widely criticized. On Tuesday, World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus tweeted, quote, "It's unconscionable that some COVID-19 vaccine-producing companies are reporting record profits and some countries are offering boosters while so many people remain unprotected," he said. On Wednesday, U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy defended the decision.
Look, I do not accept the idea that we have to choose between America and the world. We clearly see our responsibility to both, and that we've got to do everything we can to protect people here at home while recognizing that tamping down the pandemic across the world and getting people vaccinated is going to be key to preventing the rise of future variants.
On Wednesday, the Biden administration announced all nursing homes must fully vaccinate their staff or risk losing federal Medicare and Medicaid funds. The administration is also considering taking federal action against Florida, Texas, and other states that have prohibited mask mandates in school. Meanwhile, the school board in the city of Paris, Texas, has added masks to the school district's dress code in an effort to circumvent a ban on mask mandates issued by Republican Governor Greg Abbott, who's tested positive for coronavirus. In Tokyo, officials at the upcoming Paralympics have reported the first confirmed coronavirus case in the Olympic Village. This comes 5 days before the Games open. On Tuesday, Tokyo extended a state of emergency in the city until September 12th. Meanwhile, Australia has just reported its biggest one-day rise in COVID-19 infections since the pandemic began, as the Delta surge continues to spread rapidly across the globe. In Haiti, the death toll from Saturday's devastating 7.2 magnitude earthquake has risen to about 2,200, with more than 12,000 people injured. The quake destroyed more than 7,000 homes, leaving tens of thousands homeless. Many hospitals were damaged. Aid's only begun to arrive in some of the affected areas as survivors fear they've been abandoned.
If they send aid, we have to receive it. Let them not keep it. They have abandoned the people. We have no president. We have no lawmakers. We have no senators. We have been abandoned. We are just waiting for God.
In California, the fast-moving Caldor fire has leveled most of the town of Grizzly Flats, including the town's elementary school, community church, and post office. The fire's expanded to over 62,000 acres. On Wednesday, CAL FIRE authorities transferred 30 engines from fighting the massive Dixie Fire to the Caldor fire. California is now battling at least 13 major fires. The Texas Supreme Court has ruled absent Democratic lawmakers can be arrested after they fled the state last month to block a vote on a new voter suppression bill. Last week, the Speaker of the Republican-controlled House signed 52 arrest warrants to compel the Democrats to return to the Texas Capitol. An appeals court upheld Texas's ban on dilation and evacuation, or D&E, the most commonly used abortion method in the second trimester. The decision vacates a ruling last year that said the ban was unconstitutional. Doctors who defy the law could face prison time. This ban is about cutting off abortion access and nothing else, said Whole Woman's Health, a plaintiff in the case. In Burma, the civilian death toll since the February 1st military coup has topped at least 1,000, according to a local rights group. Over 5,700 people have been arrested, charged, or sentenced. A COVID-19 surge is further compounding the crisis in Burma, with shortages in medical resources and many patients too scared to visit hospitals, which have been under attack by the military. In Burkina Faso, at least 47 people died Wednesday in an attack by armed men in the town of Arbinda. The dead included 30 civilians and 14 soldiers. Meanwhile, in neighboring Niger, the government has declared 2 days of mourning after gunmen on motorbikes killed 37 civilians, including 14 children, Monday. Human Rights Watch reports armed Islamist groups have killed over 420 civilians in western Niger since January. In news from the occupied territories, Israeli authorities have demolished a Palestinian kindergarten just days before it was set to open. The demolition took place in the town of Beit Sfafa, near Jerusalem. In a victory for indigenous rights and the environment, a federal judge Wednesday blocked construction permits for a massive oil and gas project in northern Alaska known as the Willow Master Project. Environmental and indigenous groups sued the U.S. government to stop the multi-billion-dollar deal with ConocoPhillips, which was approved last year by the Trump administration and backed by Biden's Interior Department. Groups argued the project, which was set to produce more than 100,000 barrels of oil a day for the next 30 years, would disrupt fragile wildlife and contribute to the climate emergency. The Environmental Protection Agency has banned the use of chlorpyrifos, a common pesticide which has been linked to brain damage in children. The Obama administration said it would ban the use of the pesticide in 2015, but the ban never took effect before it was reversed by the Trump administration. The pesticide is used by farmers on more than 50 fruit, nut, cereal, and vegetable crops. And the acclaimed Italian surgeon, Dr. Gino Strada, has died at the age of 73. Strada was the founder of the medical aid group Emergency, which provides assistance to civilian victims of war. He worked in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Yemen, Rwanda, and other countries. In 2015, he won the Right Livelihood Award.
Just like deadly diseases has to be prevented and cured, violence is not the right medicine. It does not cure the disease, it kills the patient. The abolition of war is the first indispensable step in this direction.
To see our 2005 interview with Dr. Gino Strada, visit democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Democracy Now!'s Nermeen Sheikh. Hi, Nermeen.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Today, we spend the hour on Afghanistan, where protesters have taken to the streets for a second day in a row in defiance of the Taliban, which seized control of the country Sunday. Protests have been held in Kabul and other cities today to mark Afghan Independence Day. Al Jazeera reports 2 people died in the city of Asadabad after the Taliban opened fire on protesters waving the Afghan national flag. This comes a day after the Taliban killed 3 protesters in Jalalabad. On Wednesday, ousted Afghan President Ashraf Ghani spoke publicly for the first time since fleeing Kabul. He spoke from the United Arab Emirates. Ghani said he left to prevent more bloodshed.
All my colleagues in the West told me that if I don't leave, things would be worse. I could have stayed and started a war, but I had a responsibility to my people, and I didn't want to start a bloodbath like in Syria and Yemen.
Ghani said if he had not left Afghanistan, quote, the people of the country would have seen another president hanging on the noose of Syria. This comes as President Biden says U.S. troops will stay in Afghanistan until every American is evacuated, even if that means staying beyond his August 31st deadline. Evacuation flights are continuing from the Kabul airport, but the Taliban's preventing many Afghans from reaching the airport, with some being shot or whipped. A student in Kabul told Reuters no women could be seen on the streets after the Taliban took control of the city.
The girls are not out from their homes, and they are at homes. And 2 days I don't see any girls in the street in Kabul. They are afraid. They are scared from the Taliban.
For more, we're joined by 3 Afghan women who have fled their country. One left in 2017. One left last month, but was planning to return, and one left Friday, just for a brief visit to the United States. Let's begin with Nasreen Nawa. She was in Kabul until Friday and joins us from Lincoln, Nebraska, where she's a Fulbright scholar at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She's a former journalist with BBC Persian based in Kabul, and her piece published Monday in the Washington Post is titled "My Taliban Nightmare Came True. I left, but my sister couldn't." In it, she writes, quote, "Since before I left Kabul a few days ago, I keep having the same nightmare. My sister running, sweating, bleeding, followed by Taliban fighters on the streets of Kabul. Then the nightmare came true." Nasreen Nawa, your sister is a journalist like you. Tell us what happened to her on Sunday after the Taliban seized control and since then.
She was out of the house like so many other people in Kabul because everyone was so terrified and desperate to complete some official documents and apply for some visas in other countries. My sister was in the bank to take some money, but the bank refused to get her money. It was 2 days before their takeover that banks didn't have enough money. So we were actually facing with difficult things that we were thinking something bad is happening, but not such a thing that they get the power. And my sister heard that everyone is shouting that Taliban came and we should run away. So she starts running to the house, and she cannot find her way out of that crowd, and she is so scared and crying. So finally she finds her way to the apartment, but at the house, just my family think that a bar is coming. They will start killing people right now. It won't be something easy and calm. So they try to call some people to help my sister get out of the country at the moment, and it failed because flight got cancelled.
And Nasreen, can you talk about what her situation is now and all the other people you know of who are trying to leave Kabul, trying to leave Afghanistan?
They are totally hopeless and stuck at their houses. They don't dare to go out for walking or doing something. And the only hope is right now that the normal life resume in Afghanistan. They start normal flights, that everyone can use it, because not everyone can get that emergency opportunity that the United States offer to vulnerable people in Afghanistan. My sister just told me an hour ago that we received guests from Herat City and another province that they heard that you can just go out by reaching to the airport, but it's not easy. They are stuck at our house and they cannot find their way to the airport. Taliban don't allow anyone, and it's just a violence running there right now.
And Nasreen, can you describe what your sister witnessed once she was at home to your neighbor's house and one of the men in that house?
Yeah, it was last night. She was not able to sleep, and we were talking. She sent me a video of our neighbors that he is beaten with Taliban. They are like 4 or 5 fighters with their big guns, and the person is just civilian without any gun. So they searched his body and they beat him and pushed him into the house and locked the doors. So we don't know what happened after that, but it's terrifying, because I was thinking, yeah, what if my sister is the next person? And I begged her to leave our house for a while and find somewhere that's not known by people, because we almost are known with everyone in Kabul, at least in the city. They can find easily our house, and we think that they are engaged in so many important things like political things and settling the offices, and after that they will start very strategically to find people who are against them and who don't accept their rules and regime.
Nasreen, before we go, you wrote, I called my sister and told her to go home and hide all of our identity cards. Then I told her that she needed to destroy her guitar. She said her hands were unable to do that, but I pleaded with her. I told her the Taliban's hands are capable of killing you for your art. Now, the Taliban insists that they are different now, that they won't be attacking women, that they won't be attacking opponents. What is your response to this?
They are attacking people. They are attacking women, but they are not seen by the world because there is not enough coverage. there is not enough courage to do so. They are afraid. We cannot see that the TV channels or media outlets are doing the same thing that they were even doing last week, because they want to survive. So bad things are happening. Taliban are doing exactly the same thing that they did in their previous regime. So it doesn't make any sense that they say and claim and announce something so ridiculous that they won't bother anyone. How can we believe, while you are beating everyone on the street, that they are not obeying you right now? Maybe they are not very serious right now, and they are trying to show off their personality and their beliefs. They are trying to behave with courtesy, but it's not real. It's a tactical thing. And I believe that Taliban, who took a poet last week, who killed a comedian 10 days ago, who raided some journalist houses in just these recent days, and some other people that we don't know who are they. How can they change? So what were they fighting for? If they were changed, they would come to us and tell us, let's share the power. We are changed. We believe and we respect your values. We won't bother you, and you accept us as we are. So we were able to do a deal with them without any international interference. But we were hoping that peace talks will have a result, and it didn't happen. We invested everything to have a negotiation result, and now we see that it was just like a game, and everything was planned differently.
Nasreen Nawa, I want to thank you for being with us. Fulbright scholar, now at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, a former journalist with BBC Persian based in Kabul. She left just on Friday. Her new piece we'll link to at democracynow.org for the Washington Post, headlined, "My Taliban Nightmare Came True. I Left, but My Sister Couldn't." Next up, we speak with two more Afghan women, another also a former journalist. They have both fled their country, a former Afghan refugee and New York Times reporter in Kabul, and the director of the Afghanistan Mechanism for Inclusive Peace. Stay with us. Pashto Lullaby by Dia. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. We continue now to look at Afghanistan and conditions for women, reporters, those working for peace. On Wednesday, Afghan news presenter Shabnam Doran said in a video shared on Twitter she was prohibited by the Taliban from returning to work.
My name is Shabnam Duran. I have been a journalist for 6 years, and I have been working with Mili Television when I heard that the new Taliban system's rules have changed. With the courage that I had in me, I went to the office to start my work, but the current system's soldiers didn't give me permission to start my work. They told me that the regime has changed. You are not allowed. Go home. I am asking the world to help me because my life is in danger.
For more, we're joined by two more Afghan women who have left their country, both of them now in Toronto, Canada. Mariam Safi left Afghanistan just a few weeks ago, in July. She's the founding executive director of Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies, known as DROPS, and the co-director of the Afghanistan Mechanism for Inclusive Peace. And we're joined by Zahra Nader. She's a freelance Afghan journalist who is a reporter for the New York Times in Kabul. She's now based in Toronto, where she's a PhD student in gender and women's studies at York University. She was born in Bamiyan, Afghanistan, and lived in Iran as a refugee for 7 years, returning to Afghanistan in 2003. She fled her native home in 2017 due to mounting danger she faced as a woman, a reporter, and a member of the Hazara ethnic minority, which for decades has been targeted by militants, including the Taliban, as well as the Islamic State. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Mariam, let's begin with you. You left, but we're planning to return very soon to Afghanistan. Talk about what's happened and what you're hearing back in Afghanistan right now with your organization and the people who work for it.
The situation in Afghanistan at the present moment, of course, is one that is endowed with frustration, uncertainty, fear. That is the perception, and that is the sentiment we're hearing from those that we're in contact with on the ground. And what had happened and transpired in the last few days is something that we really had not anticipated, and it was a complete shock and disbelief to all of us. We had felt that there would be some space for a political settlement, and while things were getting very difficult in the last few months between the negotiating parties, we felt that there was some degree of space there for negotiations to result in a positive solution. So what has happened has certainly caught everyone by surprise.
Mariam, could you clarify, what would you say would be a positive resolution? What did you hope the negotiations would accomplish?
Well, what all members of Afghan civil society and Afghans and Afghan society as a whole had hoped for was a political settlement to bring an end to the violence that had plagued Afghanistan for so very long. And a political settlement would have looked like a situation where both parties would come together. And of course, there would be certain compromises on the one hand, but there would also be certain promises and commitments, particularly in protecting the gains of the last 20 years. And it would have, and so that is what we were hoping to achieve. It was never one victory over another, and we all realize that a military solution to this conflict did not exist. So a political settlement would have looked as one that would have protected the gains of the last 20 years for Afghans. But as you see, that certainly did not happen.
Zahra Nader, could you talk about your own experience having fled Afghanistan not once but twice as a refugee? And in particular, you worked as a journalist there. Can you say what you've heard about how the Taliban has been responding to the attacks on journalists in Afghanistan just in the last few days?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I have been a refugee twice, and I know it is very, very hard to live as a refugee. The first time when the Taliban take over Afghanistan, my family fled to Iran. And as a refugee, I did not have any rights to education, to do what other children were doing. And that was very, very heartbreaking for me. And seeing that happening again in Afghanistan is really, really painful for me. And this is just awful that every day it is happening to Afghanistan. About my work in Afghanistan, so I worked at least around 7 years as a journalist in Afghanistan, and in all my works I was very focused on women's issue. I wanted to cover the story of Afghan women, to see what they are doing in their lives and what is their problem and what's the problem that they are dealing with. And so I have, in all those years, I have never imagined that we would reach this day, that we would again leave the Taliban, under the Taliban. I'm talking to my friends back home in Afghanistan, my journalist friend, my prosecutor friends, my friends that work with the government, at different level. And they're all saying, it seems to us that our life was on pause for 20 years. And now we are just, again, going back, starting from 2001, where we left. So that is very heartbreaking right now for me to listen to their stories and see what they are going through right now. This is how I'm feeling right now. My family and everybody is at home, and the fear of that fear that I have when I was a refugee, a 6-year-old girl flying Afghanistan in the back of a car. And I'm now seeing that happening in front of the airport. Lots of children dragging, being, in this stressful, what would happen, even the seeing, the experiencing of this situation that this woman, everybody is facing in Afghanistan. That is a trauma that will never leave them. It did not leave the fear, the experience that I had as a refugee. They still exist in me. They have I have their scars in my heart that as I go in my ways, it come back to me and make life harder for me. And I can't imagine that that's going to happen for a new generation in Afghanistan.
I wanted to ask you about being part of the Hazara minority and talk about Bamiyan, where you were born. Bamiyan may be known by the world because the Taliban blew up the Bamiyan statues, the Buddhas that were carved back in 2001. They were blown up by the Taliban on orders from the leader at the time, Mullah Muhammad Omar, after the Taliban government declared they were idols. They also destroyed the part of the statue of the Hazara leader, Abdul Ali Mazari in Bamiyan, who they had killed back in 1995. Can you talk about the Taliban 2.0 that people are talking about today, back to then, and you as a Hazara, how you feel about what's happening to your people in Afghanistan?
I feel that they would be definitely marginalized, at least for past 20 years. They received some rights, they get education, they worked, even though it was there always the systematic discrimination always existed against them in Afghanistan, but it was much better. But now I feel with the coming of the Taliban, so we can see they are just, mullahs and from one particular ethnicity, and they would not tolerate, other groups being part of their regime, although they are saying it. But I'm fearful of how people, not only Hazara people, but all people of Afghanistan would live under the Taliban, because they are the people who are coming from behind the mountains. They spend all their life fighting, and now they are here to rule our society. And I'm very, very fearful of that, how that would unfold for our future, for future of our country. Specifically talking about the Hazara problem, we have tried a lot to tell the international community that there is a lot of discrimination, systematic discrimination against Hazara people in Afghanistan, but it seems it wasn't getting very much response. But now it's even gonna get even worse because this group that are now in power in Afghanistan, they do not care about human rights, they do not care about women's rights, and they do not care about Hazara or any minority people's right. And they would do anything that they can. They would do definitely what they did, in 1990s. We know that they massacred Hazara in Mazar. They did in Bamiyan. So all of those are just the pictures that coming up to us, and very, very traumatizing moment for all of us.
Mariam, we hear a lot in the press here and elsewhere, of course, about what's happening in Kabul. Could you talk about what you know of the changes that have occurred in rural areas as well as in urban areas and the distinction between the two? Because, of course, the reports are that the Taliban has been advancing across rural areas for much of the last year, and the government has really only, Ashraf Ghani's administration has only been fully in control of urban areas. Could you talk about that?
Well, I think that to say that rural areas were under the control of the Taliban, while urban was under the control of the government, that's not entirely true. Yes, the Taliban did control certain parts of the country. There are studies that show that about 11%. In May, there was a study that I'd come upon that showed 11% of the population lived under Taliban-controlled territory. So that's 11%, and this was in May. There were districts that were contested. And then there was districts, and that was a good majority that was under the control of the Afghan government. So that was a scenario in May, and that has rapidly changed now, obviously. But in Afghanistan in the last 20 years, a lot of the development efforts have been focused and centered on cities and in urban areas, and so urban areas have benefited a lot from the international intervention, whereas rural areas, particularly villages and districts, provincial city centers have still been better, but rural areas and villages and districts have barely seen that amount of development, and that's particularly been because of either violence, corruption, and other factors that have prevented that from taking place. So it's a mixed bag, and so I would say that we have to be careful when we're looking at the rural and urban divide in Afghanistan. There's many drivers of conflict in Afghanistan, and there are many factors that have played a role in the last 20 years, and how this divide has sort of increased and why.
I mean, the president leaving was a shock to so many, right, Ashraf Ghani. It wasn't so much that the Taliban seized power in Kabul as they entered this vacuum. It wasn't that the Afghan government, that the military was fighting them. They just left despite the billions that the U.S. military had put into them. Talk about that shock and why you think that the Afghan government under Ashraf Ghani was so unpopular. Can you talk about it being, for example, what our next guest will talk about, a kleptocracy?
Well, I would say that that a lot of what has transpired in the last 5 days, particularly on Sunday when the president, we all heard that President Ghani had left. I think it's too early at this present moment to say exactly what took place, and I do not want to speculate. But I will say that the Afghan National Security Forces, and I've been seeing reports that have suggested that the Afghan National Security Forces basically just surrendered the country. I would say it wasn't the forces. It was certainly the leadership. There was a problem. There was a grave problem in leadership. Poor leadership, political disunity have been a factor of where we are today. And there's no doubt in that. And the Afghan National Security Forces themselves fought against all odds in these last few years, in these recent years, and particularly in these last few months, when there's no reinforcement, when they're not getting enough resources, and they're left to both fight and defend for themselves, and it becomes very difficult. And so the Afghan National Security Forces, I would say, even the development of the Afghan National Security Forces in the last 10 to 12 years, I would say, is when this force was actually built, when it was in fact supposed to have been built in 2001. And it was the United States that took the responsibility of building the Afghan National Security Forces under the LEAD program. And while they built an Afghan National Security Forces in large numbers, this was a force that they were both building capacity while they're also teaching them literacy at the same time. And in this process, there were a lot of areas where dependency upon the U.S. forces and NATO forces was something that was established. So there was a dependency on certain resources needed from the United States and other forces. So the dependency was there. It was still a young army at the end of the day, and building this army itself faced a lot of difficulties in the last few years. I think they fought. They did what they could, but unfortunately, I would say the leadership failed them, and that is and that's what studies will show you, and that's what reports in media would show you, that it certainly was a failure of leadership.
Mariam Safi, I want to thank you for being with us, Executive Director of the Organization for Policy, Research and Development Studies, co-director of the Afghanistan Mechanism for Inclusive Peace, and Zara Nader, Afghan journalist, PhD student at York University, both speaking to us from Canada. Next up, Washington Post reporter Craig Whitlock on the longest war in U.S. history. His new book, The Afghanistan Papers, A Secret History of the War. What the U.S. generals, what the U.S. government over the past 20 years did not tell us about what they were doing in Afghanistan. Stay with us. Dawn by Mina Karimi and the Afghanistan National Institute of Music. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we continue to look at the situation in Afghanistan and the U.S. withdrawal. On Wednesday, President Biden defended his handling of the withdrawal in an interview on ABC News with George Stephanopoulos.
No mistakes?
No, I don't think it could have been handled in a way that we're going to go back in hindsight and look, but the idea that somehow there's a way to have gotten out without chaos ensuing, I don't know how that happens.
But just last month, on July 8th, Biden rejected the idea a Taliban takeover in Afghanistan was inevitable. Several top Democrats have vowed to probe Biden's Afghanistan exit strategy. A report from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction said the U.S., quote, struggled to develop and implement a coherent strategy over the last 20 years. In 2020, while on the campaign trail, then-candidate Biden acknowledged U.S. officials had lied to the public about the war in Afghanistan. For more, we're joined by Craig Whitlock, investigative reporter for The Washington Post, long covered Afghanistan, the author of the new book just out, The Afghanistan Papers, A Secret History of the War. It goes beyond Biden to look at how the past three presidents, Trump, Obama, and George W. Bush, deceived the public year after the year about the longest war in U.S. history. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Craig. I mean, the whole debate and Congress now saying they're going to look at this exit strategy obscures what the U.S. did in Afghanistan for the past 20 years. And that's what you so deeply look at in the Afghanistan Papers. First, describe what they are.
The Afghanistan Papers are hundreds of interviews, notes and transcripts of interviews that the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan had conducted with key officials who played important roles in the war over 20 years. These were documents that were not made public until the Washington Post had to sue the government to obtain them under the Freedom of Information Act. It took us 3 years to obtain these documents, but what they show is, as you stated earlier, the public narrative was that the U.S. was always making progress. All these presidents said we were going to win the war, and yet in private, these officials were extremely pessimistic. They said they didn't have a campaign plan, they didn't have a strategy, they didn't understand Afghanistan, and thought the war was unwinnable.
Craig, well, I guess the critical question is, given all of the research that you did and what you found revealed in the Afghanistan papers, were you surprised at all that Afghanistan fell so quickly to the Taliban? I mean, really in a matter of days, provincial capital after provincial capital, and then Kabul on Sunday.
Well, I was surprised that it happened so quickly. That said, I think it was pretty obvious that the Afghan government really didn't have any popular support, or very little. It's certainly been well documented that the Afghan security forces, the army and the paramilitary police, had real problems, that the U.S. government had spent more than $85 billion to train and equip this force, and yet it was barely functioning at the end. I think what we saw in the last week were just commander after commander in the Afghan forces saw which way the wind was blowing, knew the Afghan government wasn't going to last, and so they switched sides very quickly, either under threat from the Taliban or, for offers of money. So the Afghans, this is not uncommon for them. They know they've had to suffer under 40 years of civil war or fighting with outside powers, and to survive, they've had to very quickly judge who's going to win and how they should end up on the right side.
So, Craig Whitlock, there are two issues here over this 20 years. And if you could take us back through time, because, again, what we are not getting is the brutality of the U.S. war and occupation. And the Taliban continually saying their main goal was to throw out the foreign invader. Talk about what the U.S. covered up. Then there's the issue of the corruption of the government and the U.S. involvement with that, the Afghan government. But the record of the massacres, the working with warlords, the oppression caused by the occupation.
Yeah, it's not a pretty history, the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan. As you mentioned, involvement with the warlords. Part of the problem was that the population of Afghanistan saw the United States as allying itself with warlords who had pretty brutal records during the 1990s, and certainly a long and deep history of corruption. And here was the United States partnering with them, and frankly, spending billions of dollars on the Afghan government, which went into the warlords' pockets. So the population didn't see the United States as bringing democracy and equal rights to Afghanistan. They saw them as propping up a corrupt and illegitimate government. The Taliban certainly has a very brutal record. I don't mean to minimize that in any regard, particularly how they treat women and girls. But in the end, many Afghans, particularly in rural areas, said, look, we don't like the Taliban, but we really hate our own government. At least the Taliban, we see them as Afghans. They're more sympathetic to our religious beliefs, and they're not here to help with the foreigners. So I think in the end, a lot of people saw the Taliban as the lesser of two evils.
And let's go back to the very beginning, right, when George W. Bush invaded Afghanistan. In that period when Rumsfeld was the defense secretary, you had the Taliban saying they would surrender in December if just Mullah Muhammad Omar was allowed to live with dignity in Kandahar, where they established the Taliban. Rumsfeld said no. You have, even before that, in October, when Afghanistan said, we will hand over Osama bin Laden, Bush said no.
Well, I do think the Taliban offers to hand over bin Laden were maybe a bit overstated. They had many opportunities to do that, and I think they weren't sincere. the question I think you're raising, which is an important one, is there were opportunities to try and bring the Taliban into the fold after the U.S. invasion in 2001. The Taliban government was toppled relatively quickly, but in retrospect, that was the moment to try and bring these factions together in Afghanistan, to try and have some kind of stable consensus of a political system. Instead, the United States thought it had won a clear-cut military victory. It thought it had not just defeated the Taliban, but vanquished them. It lumped them together in the same boat with al-Qaeda as terrorist groups, and so it just saw no need to negotiate with them. The problem was that over time, the Taliban gradually came back because, unlike al-Qaeda, they were really woven into the fabric of Afghan society. This wasn't a group you could eliminate, you could vanquish. They had too much support in certain parts of the country. And I think that was the miscalculation the Americans made from the beginning, was the need to bring stability to Afghanistan. You had to bring all the actors into the fold.
And Craig, can you talk about what you think the responsibility is now of the U.S. to people in Afghanistan, not only in terms of refugees and humanitarian aid, but also the fact that broader humanitarian assistance, the donor economy is under threat now with the U.S. withdrawal, and such a large part of Afghanistan is still dependent on donor aid, the government as well as the armed forces. So that, as well as the Taliban's record on opium production, what the Taliban did when they were last in power from 96, and what you expect them to do now. Afghanistan is still, I think, the largest or second largest producer of heroin in the world.
Well, that's right, the largest by a long shot. These are all great points. I mean, the fact that Afghanistan's economy has been propped up by international aid, and frankly also by the opium trade. That's the war economy and the drug economy is what has kept Afghanistan going for a number of years. Now all of a sudden you have the Taliban in charge, complete charge. What are the United States and other donor nations going to do about? Are they going to cut off their funding? That's only going to set back and hurt the Afghan people even more. It's a real paradox and a real challenge right now to figure out how is the world going to deal with the Taliban. Look, like it or not, they have control of the country right now. Afghanistan is still very, very fragile. And how is this going to play out in the coming, not just days? Everybody's focused on what's going on at the airport in Kabul, but how is this going to play out over the long term? And I don't think anyone has a clear answer to that.
And also the fact that with the, which you've just talked about earlier and others have been talking about too, the fact that the Afghan security forces relinquished control, surrendered so quickly. There's also the question of what else they surrendered, namely all the military equipment that they had as a result of the U.S. Where is that military equipment, and do you see it all now falling into the hands of the Taliban?
Well, it did all fall into the hands of the Taliban. The United States tried to get as much military equipment as it could out of Afghanistan up through July. And, so everything that wasn't nailed down and wasn't needed for the defense of Afghanistan was taken out. But, the United States had spent over $85 billion over 20 years to train and equip the Afghan army and police and to pay their salaries. So there's an awful lot of weapons, of ammunition, and other resources that made the Afghan army fairly well equipped. That's now all under the control of the Taliban. I don't know, what are they going to use it for? They're going to use it to consolidate their control of the country. But it's kind of breathtaking to think how much the United States spent to create a standing army and police force in Afghanistan. And that's either gone up in smoke or it's gone to arm the Taliban.
We're talking to Craig Whitlock, and he's author of the new book, The Afghanistan Papers. The Intercept reports, Craig, that military stocks outperformed the stock market overall by 58% during the Afghanistan war, including Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics. Quote, from the perspective of some of the most powerful people in the U.S., the Afghanistan war may have been an extraordinary success, notably the boards of directors of all 5 defense contractors in Afghanistan. If you can talk further about, I mean, the U.S. poured, and I'm sure it's much more than this, in the L.A. Times saying at a cost of $83 billion, Afghan security forces collapsed so quickly and completely. The ultimate beneficiary of the American investment has so quickly and completely turns out to be the Taliban. So the U.S. knows exactly what they have. In the Afghanistan papers, what did you find in the relationship of military contractors also driving this war forward? It wasn't just Bush. It was Obama, then Trump. And Biden certainly knew about the Obama years because he was vice president at that time. And he's the one who said, yes, you have been lied to, the American people.
Well, that's right. And the height of spending during the war was during the Obama administration, when he sent a surge of 100,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan in 2010, 2011, 2012. That's when we were spending just enormous amounts of money in Afghanistan, not just to wage the war, but to try and build up the country. And frankly, the Afghanistan papers show it was far more money than the country could possibly hope to absorb. It just didn't have the capacity to use all this money. So a lot of the money was also siphoned off by corruption, by Afghan warlords, by defense contractors. And by defense contractors, that could be anything from major American contractors who were profiting off the war to, local contractors in Afghanistan, international ones that supplied, supplies, ammunition, food, transport. I mean, the war was a very expensive war to wage in a landlocked country halfway around the world, and the United States spent more than $1 trillion on its operations there. There's not a whole lot to show for that, but a lot of people, whether it's Afghans or defense contractors or, frankly, warlords and the Taliban, profited off that war for 20 years.
And lastly, Craig, on your book, the book that is out this month, the Afghanistan Papers, in addition to the reporting that you did that was published in the Washington Post as a series, the Afghanistan Papers, for the book, you've obtained access to copies of oral interviews with senior military and government officials documenting their perception of the Afghan war as it unfolded. Could you speak specifically about the role of General Mark Milley, who is now the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? What you learned from the interviews with him?
Yeah, he has a long history in Afghanistan. I believe he was first there in 2003. He was a colonel then, and ironically, his job at first was to help create an Afghan army and police force, and he was helping to oversee the training to really build this Afghan army from scratch. At the time, in his oral history interview, he's sort of optimistic about this. He says this will work. Here's some of the challenges, but the United States can make this happen. And over the years, of course, Milley rose through the ranks. He kept rising up through the chain of command until now he's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But it's interesting. He has such a long history in Afghanistan, but in public, he was always extremely optimistic. In 2013, he was the deputy commander of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, and he would talk about winning and victory and how good the Afghan security forces were. And even as the United States started to withdraw during the Obama administration, Milley was among the generals who kept expressing complete faith in the Afghan forces. And even though there were clear reports that they weren't doing that well, that they couldn't hold territory, Milley always vouched for them in public. Yet the Afghanistan papers show that Army officials, U.S. Army officials, knew there were just fundamental flaws with the Afghan security forces and just didn't have any faith that they would be able to defend their country. And that's the paradox we see again and again in the Afghanistan papers. The generals at the Pentagon kept telling the American people that they were making progress, that they would emerge victorious in the end. And yet in private, many of these same people were admitting that they just didn't see a good outcome, that this war was unwinnable, and that the truth really was being withheld from the U.S. people.
Craig Whitlock, we want to thank you for being with us, investigative reporter for The Washington Post, author of the new book, The Afghanistan Papers, A Secret History of the War. It's out at the end of the month. And that does it for our show. Democracy Now! Produced with Renee Feltz, Park, Dina Gezder, Messiah Reds, Nermeen Sheikh, Meredith Tarsena, Tammy Warrenoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alkoff, Tamari Studio. Special thanks to Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.